I feel like masculinity has failed me in my life, while simultaneously feeling like it's a part of who I am, how I identify myself to be, and trying to both reconcile those things and imagine a future where a masculinity can be something that inspires like positive social action rather than being like one of the primary forces in the world that's responsible for violence against others and ourselves. And that I think has to be possible. Otherwise we leave a whole segment of the population out of the possibility of loving well, and like being a force for good in the world. So I think, imagining what masculinity could be beyond sort of the common sense answers is really crucial. And this is an attempt to sort of start that conversation, or to at least invite some people into thinking about it a little bit more, men specifically, and to show other men that there are men that are thinking about these things. Yeah, so. Maleness or masculinity is a part of the story that I tell about myself, the story that I feel embedded in and participating in. And so to me, what masculinity is merely sort of what I do in the world as a man. You know, if I identify with and I'm walking a story that's grounded, at least in part, in masculinity, then, and I identify as a man, then it's the performance of that sort of defines what masculinity is in my particular context. And I think all of us who identify as men are constantly remaking and reimagining in our own actions what masculinity is and can be. And so that brings me a lot of hope in terms of the future of masculinity, particularly amongst those who are thinking critically about these things, because I believe that we're, in our day-to-day choices and actions, potentially remaking masculinity into something more than what it has been, or something different. Yeah, so identifying as a man, trying to explore masculinity as a queer person, as a queer man specifically, is complicated. I think, the fact that I love and have relationships with men in my life romantically and sexually, in sort of general culture, minimizes the amount to which I get to participate in conversations about masculinity, because in some people's view, that automatically sort of excludes me from what it means to be a man. But for me, queerness in relation to my gender, I think it's my way of sort of it's like a self-exemption from the norms and boundaries of what constitutes masculinity. It allows me to use masculinity as a tool to explore my way of being in the world without being limited to sort of the traditional boundaries around what men are allowed and not allowed to do. And so I can, experiment with makeup. I can, explore my emotions and try to lean into how to be vulnerable and to cry more, and all of those various things. I can, enjoy art and music more than I do sports, and none of those things make me less of a man in any way. And then in terms of sexuality, queerness for me is again, it's a bit of a self-compassion identity. I think it allows me to honor the path that I've walked to get to where I am, which has included, loving both men and women in romantic and sexual ways, and honor my present in, particularly loving a man in my life right now and wanting to pursue a romantic relationship with him, and also giving myself the grace and the opportunity to change and become and learn, and to follow connection as it comes in my life without being quarantined to a particular segment of people who exist in the world. So it's really an invitation to, and a reminder to myself and to others that I'm not a fixed, stagnant being. I'm a becoming, evolving, learning, growing person in the world who I think is at my best when I give myself the space to do that. So one of the joys that I've had in my life in the last few years, and in my work with Generous Space, and some of the academic work that I do is in relation to queerness as well, is that I've had the chance to walk alongside of some people in my life who are really pushing the boundaries of gender for themselves, and doing some of the same work that I am around gender expression and how I am in the world, what that looks like. And for some of those individuals, they have gone through that process and discerned for themselves that they fit within sort of non-binaryism, right? They identify as non-binary. They move into using they, them pronouns rather than he, him pronouns, or he, him, and they, them pronouns. And that sort of non-binary identity has given them a real sense of empowerment in terms of who they are and how they are in the world. And one of the things that I've really loved is to be able to celebrate and walk alongside that with them, and to do some of the same explorations in my own life, to be able to play around with makeup and go out in the world in makeup on occasion, and to, sometimes wear more traditionally effeminate clothing, or to, not worry about how I hold my body, to be okay with, allowing my voice to go out of this vocal fry that I've learned to make my voice lower, to allow myself to talk up here more so that I actually don't sound like a frog all the time, which is a process of unlearning. And one of the differences for me, and one of the important parts of why I wanted to make this video, is that I think there's a group of people who are doing some of the same explorations like myself, but feel very rooted in masculinity at the same time. That there's that want to hold on to or pursue how to push the boundaries of masculinity without redefining themselves. Or for me, it's really that, being a man, identifying as a man, has been so much a part of my story, and that itself has never been a negative thing for me. It's been these toxic masculine pressures that have been put upon me that have made that really, really challenging. And so what I'm interested in is having a conversation about masculinity that both opens itself up to, queer men who are exploring those things, and might be, playing around with drag and makeup and all of this sort of stuff, and still identifying very much within that masculine sort of area, gender area, and also because I think that conversation extends to straight men who also identify as men, and to reclaim masculinity as something that isn't necessarily just about the way that we express gender in the world. There's a Instagram guy that I have been seeing around every once in a while. I don't remember his name, but he's a straight man who goes out and heels in a dress every day, and I think that's fabulous. It really opens us up to explore why we allow gender, particularly like masculinity and femininity, to become these essentialized forces in the world, and why we don't move in this direction of saying, gender creativity, and sort of like how can I stay true and honor this part of who I am, while also unlearning all of its toxic elements, while also trying to figure out how not to, diminish and abuse women in my life, and to lean into, emotional fluency and competency, and be able to take care of myself and the other men in my life, and not rely on women to do that. I think part of the reason why that's so important is that if as feminists and as queer people, if we're not going to have a conversation about masculinity that invites straight men to do this better, frankly, we're fucked in relation to like the possibility of creating a better world. Like, we have to be able to explore, articulate, imagine pathways for men to be better and to love better in the world. And I think that if straight men allow themselves looking towards queer men who are doing some of this work, is one option to say, like, put on some damn nail polish and see how that makes you feel, and talk about that with the men in your life. Like, does that take away from your masculinity? Why do you think that? Like, how is this making you uncomfortable and vulnerable? And talk about that with each other, because masculinity has nothing to do with a little bit of paint on your nails, right? Like, what is masculinity for you? And really boil it down and peel away all of the toxic shit and come back to what that really means for us. And I think that isn't a gender exclusive thing. When we peel it all away, masculinity can come down to integrity and leadership and an opportunity to problem solve, and all of these various things, which in and of themselves are not bad things and are not exclusive to men in any way, shape, or form. But they're things that, for one reason or another, have been meaningful in positive ways in our lives. And so how do we reorient ourselves towards those things and get rid of all the violent bullshit that both hurts ourselves and, more importantly, hurts all of the people in our life, particularly women and particularly the young boys who are imposing these things on? So how do we imagine something different? I don't have an answer to that. I just think that it's got to be possible. Otherwise, the project of feminism, leaves out 40 to 50% of the world, and that's that can't be the way it works, right? Yeah. The people that come to mind first and foremost are my father and my grandfather, but also my brother in various ways in our life. And then on top of that, a lot of sort of like peers, particularly in high school and college, who were also sort of forming their own understandings of who they were. And through pressure and bullying and all of these various different things, sort of taught me what the people around me expected in terms of masculinity. So in terms of my dad, I grew up in a household that I'm grateful, I can, gratefully say, allowed me to feel my feelings the way that I needed to. I had a mom who really created space for me to be sad, to cry, to experience a range of emotions other than anger. And that's really benefited me in the long run in terms of my own ability to cope and to process my emotions. However, my dad never silenced that emotional expression, but he needed it to be productive. My father would sort of dwell in the emotions with me for a short period of time, and then ask questions like, "What did you learn about this? How do we mobilize this in productive ways? What do we learn about this that we can move on from next time?" And I think, again, that's provided me with some really amazing tools in terms of not just feeling and in an embodied way feeling my emotions, but also problem solving around like how to navigate emotionally difficult circumstances, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the positive side of things. I think as the pressures of masculinity from other individuals in my life, and including from my father at times, have led me to go directly to the productivity side of emotions, and a lot of my life has involved trying to get back in touch with my body and understanding how emotions impact my body and my gut and my joints and all of these various ways that emotions really, when they're not felt, when they're not dealt with, we can't heal from them. And I'm continuously learning to do that rather than automatically asking how my emotions can be helpful or productive in my life, a teacher of sorts. In terms of my grandfather was not an emotional person at all. And if he was emotional, it was in anger or frustration. My emotional connection with my grandparents was all through my grandmother, not through my grandfather. He was a very strong, independent man that I looked up to quite a lot as a child. He was a man of God. He was a man of faith, and he had very strong opinions on what was right and wrong in the world, and made his opinion known. And he sat around a lot while my grandmother cleaned and cooked and those sorts of things. I mean, he did a lot. He worked very hard, but he also didn't do any of the sort of housework stuff until my grandmother was very old and ill, and he needed to learn those things. And I think, in terms of my father and grandfather together, while I never necessarily felt directly silenced emotionally by the men in my family, the predominant way in which both of those men expressed themselves in the world was through frustration and anger when difficult circumstances came. And that I think is understandable, because my grandfather did not teach my father how to process his emotions well. And while my mother is quite adept at that, when you're weak and vulnerable and falling apart, you default to your most comfortable coping skills. And for my father, that was frustration and anger. And so, while I didn't feel directly discouraged from feeling emotions, I definitely, my grandfather and father definitely modeled the way that men express themselves in the world on a regular basis. So I saw myself as being a more emotional man, as being outside of that model, as being deviant in some way, and that was very difficult for me at times in my life. And then lastly, I guess, in terms of school contexts and peers, I was made fun of a ton for being a more emotional individual, for being attentive in school, for being interested in the arts and music and drama and all of these sorts of things. And all of these activities were things that I was really, really passionate about. I also loved sports, but I wasn't as good at sports as the other guys in my class. And I was bullied a lot for those chosen activities, and as a result, I was friends with mostly women through my high school and undergrad experience, because they were the women in my life were people who seemed willing to allow me to be emotional when I needed to, and were also physical. Like, I was allowed to hug them and to touch them in ways that wasn't necessarily immediately, indicative of homosexuality. Like, I wasn't immediately gay when I touched women in my life, whereas there was so much self-policing in high school for me around boys. I had to be really careful about how I held myself, how, the way that I dressed, what emotions I showed and didn't. I can remember vividly, which is ridiculous, getting changed in the change room one time and folding my clothes after taking them off and putting them on the bench, and being ridiculed by the men in the change room for folding my clothes, which is just such a stupid small thing, right? But there was so much self-consciousness and self-policing around how to belong, and how to earn the love and affection of male friends and the men in my life. The majority of my experiences of sort of formation around masculinity have been in being told in one way or another that I don't belong in that category, that my choices, that my way of being in the world violates the boundaries of masculinity and moves into a sort of feminine category that meant that I didn't have a lot of close male friends, that I wasn't super close in the same way that I was with my mom, with my father, that my relationship with my father was mostly intellectual and ideas based rather than emotional and connected. Like, as I sit here today, the biggest pressures that I'm working on in my life right now are around what kind of emotion I'm allowed to feel in my relationships with both men and women in my life. Particularly, there's a lot of internal policing on my part around how messy I can get in my emotions. I'm quite well practiced at crying in front of my friends, but only to the extent where I feel like I'm in control. Like I can cry, but I've got it. I've got this figured out. It's all under control. I just need to feel right now, and then I'll be fine, type thing. And there's been a number of significantly challenging periods in my life, whether that's relationship breakdown or family illness or just mental health issues, where I haven't felt like I'm okay, and where I've needed people in my life to be okay with me falling apart, to be okay with me not being in control of my emotions, and to not know what happens next. Because I think that the moments when I felt the most loved by men in my life specifically have been moments when I have hit a threshold and fallen apart with them in a way that wasn't controlled, and their ability to show up for me in that. I had a really close friend in university named Cameron, and he and I were best friends for the last 2 years of university. And during this time, I was really wrestling with the fact I was at a Christian college. I was really wrestling with the fact that I was attracted to men and that was not okay in my particular environment. And I was struggling with pornography at the time, and there was all of these struggling with pornography. There was all of these factors that were feeding into a really negative self-hatred, and I was suicidal and depressed and barely holding on. And I don't remember exactly what happened, but I can remember walking into my apartment, which Cameron shared with me, and walking into the hallway between our bedrooms and talking to him briefly, and he gave me a hug, and I collapsed onto the floor in tears. I don't remember what it was about, but I remember him just being able to sit there and hold me while I cried. And I don't know that there's been another moment like that in my life where he didn't try to fix the situation. He didn't say it was going to be okay. He didn't do any of that stuff. He just sort of let me fall apart and was present with me and offered me touch, which, I need from men in my life. And I think a lot of men desire from other men. And that's something that's not allowed in, Western toxic masculine environments. So one of the concepts that's been really useful for me in terms of growing in relation to masculinity is this concept of toxic masculinity, that there's this the word is like hegemonic, or like this sort of norm around what it means to be a man that has this sort of coercive pressure on men that pulls us into behaving in particular ways for fear of social consequence in one way or another. And in the case of toxic masculinity, some of those characteristics, some of what characterizes toxic masculinity are things like dominance and domination, a propensity for violence and to solve problems through violence, a limiting on what kinds of emotions men are allowed to feel, especially with each other, with sort of an allowance for anger and frustration, and a diminishing or a discouragement of emotions around even things like love or appreciation or sorrow or grief or sadness. All of those things sort of are channeled through this one emotion of anger. And it also, toxic masculinity is associated with that idea that there's this sort of notion of what it means to be a man, and if you deviate from that, you're less than, you're feminine, you're moving away from what it means to be a real man, and therefore you need to be called back in some way, whether that's, or called out in some way, whether that's through bullying or subtle comments or through a look or a gesture or gaze from someone that shows you that you've gone out of line. And that's policed by both men and women in the world. In terms of my own life, I'm still very much trying to unlearn. I think even though as I said, my understanding of masculinity is sort of what I do and how I perform in the world, the actions that I choose to make, I'm still very much influenced by these normative understandings of what masculinity is. I find myself, watching the way that I hold my body in particular spaces, or policing my emotions in particular spaces, not being able to be to cry or to express confusion or difficulty in emotionally vulnerable ways. So I'm definitely trying to unlearn that, and I'm also trying to get comfortable with physical touch with other men, both straight and gay and queer, in ways that doesn't automatically make that a sexual gesture. I think that men are often taught that any kind of physical touch is sexual, and so I'm trying to uncouple those things and allow for intimacy and loving touch to be something that's not necessarily explicitly sexual, which is something that's quite easy, but the social pressure around that, what that means, is difficult to unlearn. So 5 years ago, I lost my dad to acute myeloid leukemia. It was a long battle over about 8 months, and it was incredibly painful for me and my family, and left a really significant impact on my life and my understanding of myself, and it's been a long process of healing around that loss, and trying to process the grief in that. And about a year ago, historically, my family has gotten together on my dad's death day, and we've been together and dwelt together in our grief, and lit a candle and really just tried to dwell in our remembrance of my father. And about a year ago, on November 12th, which is my dad's death day, I couldn't be home with my family. I don't remember why, but I couldn't. It was probably in the middle of the week, and I couldn't get back to Kitchener. And I, for some reason, because I didn't want to be vulnerable. I didn't tell anyone in my life that was my dad's death day, other than those who already knew. What I did do was I shared a photo of my father on Instagram, and with a little remembrance post. And almost immediately, my friend PJ messaged me and said, "We're having dinner tonight. Come over." And so I went. I wasn't sure that I wanted to, but I went. And PJ had prepared this amazing meal for me and our friend Adam. And both of these men have also experienced loss in their life of close male family members. And PJ sort of quickly acknowledged the need for dwelling together and solidarity in loss and in grief. And we sat around a small table and shared food and cried and told stories and normalized vulnerability and normalized weakness and sorrow and fear, and the way that this has changed our understanding of relationships in our lives, and how alone it can make you feel with those who haven't lost someone who's close to you. And it did a few things. One, it's exactly what I needed, and to spend time, especially over food, with two men that I respect who could dwell in grief with me without trying to problem solve, without trying to make it easier, just acknowledging how difficult it was, and offering presence, was an incredibly healing thing for me in terms of imagining possibilities for male relationships in my life. Those are some of the closest friends I have now. And all of us can look back and recognize that day as the beginning of something new in our relationships with each other. And so I think, in answer to the question, what are my hopes for the men in my life? I think it's that we learn to love each other well, and that we learn to acknowledge that loving one another well, and loving the women and children in our lives well, and the non-binary folks and everybody in between, is to allow ourselves to be vulnerable and weak and messy with each other, and to learn to be comfortable with that, with the other people in our lives, and to allow them to be messy and vulnerable and weak, and to show up and to work on ourselves so that we don't automatically go to shutting down those emotions and to problem solving. I think there's so much in that story that gives me hope for queer men healing with each other, but also there's nothing in that story that is outside the possibility for straight men. That we have the capacity to heal through taking responsibility for our own emotions and the emotions of the men in our lives, rather than automatically expecting or hoping for women to do that work for us and with us. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but to show up for each other in that way, and to realize that if we're not doing that, we're either exploiting the labor of women in our lives, or we're gonna express it in other ways, whether that's through anger or through mental illness, mental health issues, whether that's through, I have terrible stomach issues from so much anxiety and pain in my life that's gone unworked on, and in the process of healing from and through the grief in relation to my father, but unlearning toxic masculinity and getting more in touch with my body and my emotions as a man, I have healed my physical body at the same time. And that's, after doing counseling, after seeking help, after, building relationships with people in my life, that's a no-brainer. Like, of course, that's what's causing my physical pain. But I don't know very many men who are willing to acknowledge the ways that unprocessed emotion impacts our well-being, and I think that if we look at so many of the statistics around instances of violence, so many statistics around mental illness, mental health issues, around addictions, around all of these sort of systemic problems, they have something in common, which is their higher percentage. There's a much higher percentage of men who are involved in these things than women. Not necessarily involved in terms of like mental health care and all of those sorts of things. What I mean is, when we look at addictions, when we look at instances of violence, when we look at mental health issues, the percentage of people that have who are men who struggle with those things or enact those things in the world is so much higher. And I think a huge part of that is this unprocessed toxic masculinity, this inability for us to show up for each other in processing violence from others, processing violence against ourselves, processing, unlucky or unfair life circumstances, to talk about what's difficult, what's hard, to fall apart with each other, to be messy, all of those things. Not that would automatically solve all the world's problems, but I do think it's an important facet in addressing the systemic issues that are the most important ones of our time. Even if we look at what's happening down south right now. I mean, the number of interviews I saw on CBC of Trump voters who talked about Trump being a man's man is ridiculous, right? Like, toxic masculinity is a huge component in the divisiveness that's happening, the polarization that's happening in American and Canadian politics. And I think if we were able to actually talk through our emotions with other men, with women, with counselors, to actually seek support around the emotional challenges in our lives, we might not be where we are, or we might be able to actually work ourselves out of where we are into something that's more about loving community, more about a nation that cares for its citizens across the board, regardless of sexuality, gender, immigrant status, all of those various things. If we learn to actually talk about our emotions well, and to process them and to feel them with each other, I think that'd be a great place to start. So one of the reasons for this conversation was actually because my dad's death day is coming up on November 12th. I'm in a popular education class where I'm thinking about how can I engage in conversations that are shared publicly, and can engage in dialogue with people around issues that I think are really important that I'm learning about. The conversation was prompted largely from wrestling with the ways that masculinity failed me during my dad's illness. It's taken some time to really process that, and I think I still am in many ways. But my relationship with my father prior to him getting acute myeloid leukemia and being in the hospital for almost 8 months on and off. So prior to my dad getting sick, my relationship with him was largely intellectual, ideas-based, and I loved that component of it, but we really weren't practiced at talking about difficult emotional things. And if we were, it was in relation to faith and spirituality, and not in relation to sort of fear and weakness and vulnerability. And so when it came to sitting at my dad's bedside and watching him slowly die over 8 months, basically, we had to learn this stuff really fast. And there was many instances along the way where I failed him and he failed me in our capacity to support one another in this really, really difficult process. I know I had one really powerful memory that has stuck with me where, about a week into my dad after his diagnosis, he was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia and rushed to the hospital because his platelet counts were really low. And they put him on, they sort of started pumping him full of platelets and saline at the same time to try to get his platelet count up. And for one reason or another, what ended up happening was he ended up having so much liquid in his body, so much saline, that he almost drowned. And his lungs filled with fluid. He had something similar to pneumonia, basically. And they had to do an emergency surgery where they went into his lungs and sucked out all of the liquid to try to keep him alive. And we didn't know whether he was going to make it through that. There was all these scary conversations in the operation room, and my mom and I were singing "Great Is Thy Faithfulness" with nurses running around us and things. It was sort of equally comedic and tragic. And he made it through. But he was intubated during that period, and he was moved to a room on the cancer ward where he had his intubation taken out, but he still couldn't speak. And for those of you who don't know, acute myeloid leukemia generally, when it progresses, it shows up as like really, really severe pain because it impacts your bone marrow, and anytime you move, it's excruciating. And so he was in excruciating pain. He had almost just died and had his lungs pumped out. He couldn't speak. And I was standing in the room with my mom and I think one or two nurses. And he started looking panicked. And none of us really knew what was going on. By the time we realized that he needed to use the washroom, the nurses came in and tried to help him up so that he could make his way to the washroom. I didn't know how to help, so I was at a distance, and my dad urinated himself all over the front of his hospital gown, and for me, that's when my emotions broke. Like I fell apart, and immediately my reaction was to leave the room. Partially because I didn't want my dad to see my emotions, but partially because I just couldn't handle being seen in that weak place. And I went out into the hallway and I leaned against the wall and I just cried and cried and cried. And I can remember leaning there and watching all of these nurses run into the room. And in hindsight, I don't judge anybody in that instance, including myself, but it was just sort of this emblematic moment of my father and I both falling apart in our own ways, and all of these women surrounding us, all of the nursing staff, my mom, just sort of like sweeping in and into our weakness and our vulnerability and holding us up. And I'm so grateful for that. And like, men, we need to do better. Like, and there was many instances of that kind of weakness and vulnerability as my father got sicker and sicker, as he had to have his testes removed at one point, as he had to use a bedpan and continue, it was all of these incredibly vulnerable, shaking moments for him around what he considered himself to be, this sort of towering figure of leadership and intellect, and my ability to like be with my father in that instance, and for him to be with me in the difficulty of that was just not there. The most intimate that I got with him was kissing his forehead every day before I left. I wasn't able to hold his hand for long periods of time before like the day of his death. Like it took me a long time to get to a place of dwelling with him in the kind of love that I wanted to be able to show. And so I felt very much like masculinity failed me in that journey. And similarly, for my father, there was an incredible amount of emotion that went into that process of fighting cancer, going through chemo, having your hopes, established and then dashed and established and then dashed, that were incredibly emotionally taxing. And there were times when my father was able to talk about that and to do that really well. And there was a bunch of instances where my dad was just really angry and really frustrated and took that out on us as his family and my mom, and in ways that wasn't appropriate. And it's understandable, we want to extend grace to people who are in that kind of challenging of circumstance. But masculinity failed my father in this process. His ability to process his emotional journey without harming the people in his life was just not there. And I don't want to be that man. There's so many ways in which I want to be my father and to learn from him and grow in him. I could talk about all of his positive attributes as well, but I don't think my father wants from me that either. Some of the conversations that we were able to have when he was dying were about the ways that he had learned from and was being taught by my journey and what I'm learning to be. And so I want to take that, and I want to talk about that with the men in my life and say, like, if we want to be able to go through the shit that life throws at us in ways that doesn't harm particularly the women in our lives, we need to be able to show up for ourselves and for others by allowing us to feel our emotions in healthy ways and to talk those through, to seek help when we need it, to talk to a chaplain, to talk to a therapist, to actually, seek the help that we need, because these are difficult circumstances and anger is just not going to cut it. It's not going to cut it, and it's not going to result in healthy relationships with the people around us. So I think for me, one of the learnings that I'm taking out of, one of the ways in which I'm making my father's death productive for me, one of the learnings that I'm trying to enact in my life is learning from the ways that masculinity failed me in the midst of illness and death and grief, and how can I learn to do that better for myself and to have conversations and dialogue with the men in my life in ways that allows them to do the same.